Okay, so today we're going to talk through managing expenses in Workamajig. We're going to talk through quite a bit. We're going to talk through the standard expense types in Workamajig here, how to pay those, and take a look at what's open in terms of expenses, and the workflow for the various different pieces that are a part of these expenses. I'm sure it's probably pretty clear to most of you here that tracking project expenses and overhead expenses properly are a big part of making sure that you have all of the detail in all of your projects, right? Making sure we know what the cost of a project was is important for profitability reporting. But of course, on the overhead side, outside of the day-to-day of tracking and making sure that we've reimbursed overhead expenses, kind of a true measure of where we are across all of those different types here in the system. And for expenses here, these can be tracked by internal agencies. So if you're part of a larger organization as a marketing communications team or something like that, there's still value to this, and we'll talk through those different pieces here. And of course, as a standalone agency, this would be kind of how we would tie those expense pieces into your accounting in the system, as well as at a project level, making sure we have accurate reporting on what the true cost of a project is. Let me go ahead and share here. Thank you. I'm logged in here as my site. I'm Daniel, by the way. I forgot to mention that, but nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining. I do leave some space for questions here throughout the process. I'll just kind of stop at a few points to make sure that we're all on the same page. But please feel free, if you have any questions, to go ahead and throw them in the chat or in the Q&A. I'll try to get to those throughout the call here. And I tend to try to leave a few minutes at the end of the call as well, or at the end of the presentation as well, in case you have anything associated with what we're talking about here today that you wanted to have answered. But for project expenses, we're tracking a couple of different types here, and we're really going to be bouncing between a couple of different pages here in the system. Primarily, I'm going to be on the Today Purchasing page. This is a workflow page here in Workamajig that kind of shows you where everything is in the system. So if you are in AP or in finance, this page itself is a really good resource just to give you an idea of all the spinning plates that you have out in the system. And for expenses, we're really talking about several different transaction types. Of course, we're talking about vendor invoices. That's going to be one of the big ones. We'll definitely talk about that here today. Purchase orders, if you use purchase orders, we'll kind of overview what the best practices for those are, along with some setup options, how to pre-bill them, things like that. Expense reports, credit card charges, and something we in Workamajig call miscellaneous costs. So we're going to cover all of those here, and all of those expense types can be attached to either as an overhead expense in the system or as a project expense. And this Today Purchasing page here is kind of a way to keep an eye on where all of those pieces are. So of course, we're going to go into each one of them and talk about how you'd use them, what the best practices are. But I'd like to start here, especially if your responsibility is on the expense or purchasing side of the system or finance side of the system here, just to kind of show you how these are designed. So for Workamajig, you may be familiar that these Today pages here in Workamajig are meant to be kind of a one-stop shop for a role. If I take this back one step and look at the main menu, these are all the modules that are available here in Workamajig, and almost every one of them is going to have one of these Today pages. So these are meant to be kind of all of the information for that role, and one place to kind of pull all of the information. And on the purchasing side here, we start with open items. This is a really great way to track what you have open from an expense side in the system, and make sure that those orders are following, or those open items are following through the system the way that you want them. Right, so this will show me that I have 3 open orders. So those would be purchase orders, insertion or broadcast orders. Which ones are unapproved, right? So open is basically means that they're approved. They're waiting for a vendor invoice to come into the system. Unapproved means that they're waiting for approval and they have not yet been approved. And unsubmitted, of course, means that they have not yet been sent for submission. So you can kind of see that this area here gives you an overview of everything that you have out there in the system that's been created. You don't have to go hunting them all down. The idea here is to just kind of keep you on top of that. If we look through the rest of the page, a lot of these we're going to delve into quite a bit more as we go through some of the workflow pieces, but you'll also see incoming charges for your credit card accounts. We'll talk about how to set those up and bring those charges into the system. Your invoices, this has a similar workflow to the open items, but this is more invoice based. So do you have vendor invoices that are unsubmitted or unapproved? Do you have scheduled invoices that are designed to be made on a regular basis that need to be created? Are there expense reports to approve, invoice, submit, things like that? Again, kind of different categories for each of these. And as we get towards the bottom of the workflow here, we'll see that the system keeps a list of everything that you have out there that's approved, ready to pay as of today's date or as of a date of your choosing. And when you actually create payments, kind of how to follow them through. Is it a physical check that needs to be printed? Do we need to add an ACH record? Do we need to create an ACH file? Kind of all of those here on the Today Purchasing page. But I want to start with talking through project transactions and a couple of the specific expenses that would be associated with those. And I want to start with expense reports themselves. Now, in Workamajig, we do have an expense report system. If I go back to the main menu page here, underneath everyone, there is a page specifically for expense reports. This page is meant to be for whoever's opening it, their expense reports, right? So if I open this page, it's going to say, hey, you're Daniel, here's the expense reports that you have in the system here. And this will show a user kind of where their expense reports are in the process. Now, in Workamajig, expense reports are used pretty much like you'd use them in any other system. They are a out-of-pocket payment by an employee that needs to be reimbursed by the company. So this would be the most consistent use of these here, basically saying, hey, I went to Staples and I bought some supplies or something to that effect, right? And I paid out of pocket to that, and that out-of-pocket payment needs to be reimbursed. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a company credit card typically. This is an out-of-pocket expense to be reimbursed, and there's two major workflows for these, depending on how you reimburse your employees if they use expense reports. One is to create a vendor invoice, which will basically make a payable that you can reimburse by check or ACH or however you choose to do so. The other is to mark them as paid. So basically using the expense report process to codify the approval process, right? I have a user that created an expense, they make an expense report, they send it to their approver, the approver approves it, and then it's reimbursed typically through payroll cycle. So that's really the difference between the two workflows. One is I want to create a payable. That is typically used in scenarios where you reimburse expense reports upon approval, so not necessarily through your payroll cycle, right? It's a Wednesday, we don't pay our employees till Friday, but since this expense report is approved, I'm going to cut a separate check for this expense, versus I reimburse these on payroll cycle. That would typically be added as part of your journal entry for payroll to your employees. Now, from an execution standpoint, expense reports from a user would be created from this page. If you click the new button, that will obviously create a new one. You can see that these are grouped by the category of where they are in that process. So I have a few that are unsubmitted here. I have one that's completely blank. I have one that's for $1. I'm a big spender. But if we click into any of these, the process for adding these is very similar to adding expenses pretty much anywhere, adding expenses on estimates or vendor invoices or purchase orders. Kind of the same idea. We would add a line for the expense. We would, of course, set the date for it here. That's obviously something I can adjust if I need to. You can link an expense report to a project or task. If it is associated with a project and a task, it definitely should be at the very least at a project level. So we track the expense properly to that project. So I'm going to go ahead and make one here, and go ahead and attribute this expense report to it. That's what it is, called expenses. So we'll go ahead and add our expenses in here. I'm going to go ahead and choose my project. There we go. Task is optional for this dropdown. This is really for additional reporting. If you budget all the way down to a task level, then this definitely has value. If you don't, that's perfectly fine. Just having it associated with the project it's a part of would be enough. And you can see here in the red box that the item is required. Now, this item list is a list specifically for expense report items. We have a standard list in the system. Actually, I believe this is that exact list that we're looking at currently. This list can be adjusted. So if you have a different set of categories that you want here to be attributed to your expense report items, we can add those. And in the item setup, you're able to set a lot of the defaults that users won't care about, right? So me entering in an expense report, I say, hey, I had to buy a plane ticket to go fly out to a conference, to a meeting with a client, something like that. I'd enter in the cost, the unit cost or the net. I could say it was $250 and then add my notes here. These comments would come through to your approver. But the item that I choose here has some defaults that are set with it by the team that sets it up. So typically your finance team would set these items up and they would say, okay, these are the item categories that we want to use. And then furthermore, we can set things like a standard unit cost if that applies. Most of the time, it's a little difficult for things outside of mileage expense to do that. But you can also set things like whether it should be standardized as a billable transaction. And what sales and expense GL accounts that it should post to if it's placed on a client or vendor invoice, because your expense reports are potentially billable items. So for the submitting user, they would fill out this information here. They would enter this in according to what they need. They could add additional lines. So if there was some airfare and a hotel stay and an Uber and so on and so forth, I can add all of those here. And as the submitter, if I click into the line here, anywhere into the line, you'll see these arrows on the left pop up. This is our inline editor. We're actually going to see this little guy quite a bit here on today's call. But this basically says show all of the detail that can be applied to the line of an expense, right? Whether it's an expense report or an order or an invoice. And you'll see some things in here that your submitting users may not be able to change, like billable, for example, or paper receipt. But specifically, I wanted to open this to show that you can create an attachment to a specific line on your expense report as well. So if there's a receipt, I have a digital copy that I'd like to add to this vendor to this expense report, I can go ahead and do that here. Or I can note that there's a paper receipt, right? I can just go ahead and click this. That basically lets you know to expect a paper receipt to be dropped on your desk at some point, or I guess mailed to you, depending on how that works. And so this is obviously a useful part of the submission process for an expense report. Once I've finished with this, as the submitter of an expense report, so again, this would typically be your team doing this here, I'll see either the option to submit, that's going to be the most common things that users would see, or if I'm my own expense approver, again, a little bit more rare, I will see the option to simply just approve this. Now, for pretty much everything we're talking about today, items need to be approved before they're considered billable, right? So this is a big part of the process. I will show you where to set up approval processes and how to manage those workflows here throughout the training here today. But just note that as a submitter, I'd see the option to either submit or approve, depending on whether or not I'm my own approver. And once approved, an expense report will be billable on that project, and also it will be ready to be reimbursed. So expense reports actually have two gatekeeping pieces for approval. One, can it be billed? Two, can it be reimbursed to the user that submitted it in the first place? Now, I want to come back to this page here in a moment. We'll go ahead and approve this here for now. Again, if I do submit this, this will go to an approver. They'll get a notification here in the system that they have an expense report to approve. Basically, a little red number will show up here and say, hey, you have an item to approve. It would show up under this heading, and it would show that you have expense reports. It would basically take you to this exact same page we see here behind the notifications with the option to approve or reject. Now, if you need to reject an expense report, you do have the ability to add rejection comments. So if you say, hey, you forgot the receipt, or hey, you put in $2,500, I think you meant $250, something like that, you can provide that information back to your user. When you reject an item in Workamajig, it will go back to the submitter as a notification with your comments. And so I wouldn't need to remake this entire expense report. I'd just have to go in here and go, oops, I goofed. I put in $2,500, I meant $250, make that change and then resubmit it here afterwards. Now, for expense reports, there is some setup. So before we get to the actual reimbursement process for these, I do want to open up another tab. So just bear with me here for just a moment. And I want to show you how we set up those approval changes. So I spoke to, if you're an approver, how do you get these? How do you approve them? Things like that. When you set up the expense report workflow process here in Workamajig, if I go to someone's employee record, this is typically where you would set up who their expense approver is and what that process looks like. And there's actually two pieces in here that we're concerned with. One is that actual approver. So if I'm on the employees page here and I open up my own record, in the accounting tab, provided you have the security rights to open this, you'll see the ability for any employee here in the system to say who their expense report approver is. That's right here, this drop down. right? So basically saying, hey, whenever this person sends an expense report, it goes to this person for approval. Now you can see that I'm set as my own. That's why I had the ability to approve this. But if it was set to anybody else, like if it was set to Candace here, for example, Candace would get those notifications in system and potentially by email that I've sent them an expense report to approve. This is obviously vital to set up. Even if your expense report submitters would be their own approvers, you still want to make sure that you set those approvers up and make sure they're tracking to the right place here. And upon approval, once they're approved and they're ready to be reimbursed or ready to be billed out to a client, for the reimbursement process here, it may be necessary to create a vendor record for that person as well. Under this purchasing heading here, you'll see the area for vendor. Now, this is if you need to make a payable reimbursable invoice from your expense reports. Again, remembering there's two workflows for this. One says that I pay on payroll cycle. I might just mark these as paid as I do that. The other one says that, oh no, upon approval, these are able to be reimbursed. We create a separate payable from payroll to reimburse this person. In that latter scenario where you're creating a payable, you will want to create a vendor record for your employees because Workamajig requires a vendor anytime you create a vendor invoice. And this information is set on the expense report automatically. So when we see that option here, if I tap back over to my expense report, when we see that option to create vendor invoice, Workamajig knows exactly which vendor to create this for. Now, for the vendor record creation itself, I already have one here, so it's a little bit difficult to show this, but let me go to another user here to show you. If you don't have these, like this user, my creative test user doesn't have a vendor here currently, you'll see the option to create a vendor directly out of their record if that's going to be your workflow here. This is really nice because it's a single click. When we create this vendor, we'll confirm that you want to do this here. And upon creating the vendor, we will name it for the person's name, and the vendor ID will be their first initial and last name, right? So Amanda Smith would be A Smith for the vendor ID, and the vendor's name would be Amanda Smith. This is really nice because you can kind of isolate the reimbursements that you've made to this specific person. And again, it's also a requirement since we can't make a vendor invoice without telling the system which vendor it would be created for. So if you're using expense reports, at the very least, everyone will want to check who the approver is to make sure that approval chain is set up properly. And depending on your workflow, you may also want to set up a vendor for this person. Again, if you're just reimbursing through payroll cycle, that may not be necessary. But if you reimburse as separate payables, then you absolutely do want to create a vendor, and you can do that in the accounting tab of an employee record. So again, once they're created here, I'll see the option to either create a vendor invoice, or under the More button, you'll see the option to set paid. This is again where this workflow diverges, right? So if I'm creating a separate payable, I can go ahead and create a vendor invoice with one click here. Upon approval, the system will go ahead and generate that vendor invoice for you. It will go ahead and slide this out, and it will say, hey, we need to pay this person $250 to reimburse them for the expense report that they created here. This will go into your purchasing today queue. So I'll get back on how to actually create a payment for this, or if you need to cut a check or create an ACH record to show it as paid. This will operate as the same as any other vendor invoice in your system. They are tagged a little bit different, and you'll notice when we number expense reports or vendor invoices, created from expense reports, we number them the same as the expense report itself. That just makes the reporting a little bit easier here, and it's a little bit easier to reference, oh, this was a expense report payable as opposed to a standard vendor payable. Yep. So I mentioned the other option is to set these as paid. This is a way just to kind of clean up, showing that, hey, on payroll cycle, we did set all of these as paid. If you don't pay with actual payables, you need a good way to track all of the vendor or all the expense reports that you created in a period to be able to reimburse them. For that purpose, both on the purchasing today page, and if we click this magnifying glass icon and go to views, you'll see views for expense reports. And we have a number of these here by default, but the most useful one for tracking reimbursement, especially if you're using set paid instead of using a vendor invoice, is to go to this approved but not paid page. This will give you a list of every expense report that is approved that hasn't had a vendor invoice created from it, or it hasn't been set as paid. one of those two things. So if I'm getting ready to pull payroll cycle and I go, oh, I need to make sure that I'm including the reimbursements for for expense reports on these here, this is a really good reference for you to be able to use. And again, as you're going through the process of creating payroll, you can come through here, open these individually and set them as paid, which will basically just remove them from this list, right? When I search again, it just drops off there. So this view exists in your system by default. Again, you can get to it anywhere with this magnifying glass icon, but you can also get to it under the Purchasing Today page. If we scroll down, there's an area here for views. And views, this is the same area, right? This expense reports area right here, it will show you, yep, there's my approved but not paid expense reports. Okay, a lot of stuff there for expense reports, but any questions on those? Like we're kind of humming along. If you do, feel free to throw them into the chat. I'll get to those here for you whenever you're ready. But let's go ahead and move on to the next type of project expense. So again, we're going to look, this can be actually project or separate from a project, but the next thing I want to look at here is purchase orders. And if you don't use purchase orders currently, I'm sure you probably heard of them, but in Workamajig, this is a way for us to notify finance of an impending expense. So I could be opening up a project and saying, hey, I know for this website project, we need to do some software licensing, or this is an event job. We need to rent a space and we need to buy supplies for the event. So I know that I have these impending expenses coming up for this project, even if I won't actually be paying them for a couple of months, right? So a purchase order allows you to create an order that shows finance that we have an expending expense, and it also adds an approval process around those, right? So it can say, okay, we open this event project, we need to pay for these specific expenses. I'm going to create an order for finance to approve, so that we can cover that. And also we can see that that expense is coming in. As soon as I create a purchase order, even though there's no vendor invoice, there's a record of that purchase order here in the system on the project itself, kind of showing the impending expense for it. Additionally, purchase orders can be pre-billed as well. So basically, again, in advance, where let's say that same scenario, I have an event, the event isn't for about 3 months, but we've already opened the project. I'm going to go ahead and create an order for it. I can pre-bill the client for that order, basically getting them to pay for the impending expense before it comes in. So before that vendor invoice comes into you, before you have that payable, you can basically pre-bill your client through an order to cover the cost of the expense. Now, this is very common in media, but it is also possible in standard projects as well, especially if your expenses are set to be relatively high for that project. So purchase orders kind of give you the option to do all of that here. And while you can create those manually out of this Today purchasing page, if I click plus, you'll see the option to create a purchase order. Our recommended process for these are typically to create them out of the project where the expense will be attributed to. And there's a few good reasons for that. I've actually got a project open here for our expenses here today. Let me pop into that. And as part of opening your project here, typically, of course, you would adjust your schedule, make sure that's all correct for first here. But one of the early parts of the process in your project creation here is to create an estimate. And that estimate, of course, should cover both the labor requirements for the project as well as any outside costs that would be attributed to the project. And that's regardless of whether or not you're going to bill them out to the client. Now, most of the time, I suspect that you probably would, but at the very least, we want a budget that's set through the estimate here that says, hey, we budgeted for an event space. We estimate it'll be about X number of dollars. That's already in here. Now, purchase orders can be created directly out of your estimates, which is typically the process that we would recommend. So as part of your process of opening a project, I set my schedule, I go to the estimate here. This project already has an estimate to start. And if you're unfamiliar with the estimate creation process, you can create them directly through here. When you create an estimate, you have the ability to tell Workamajig to pull the labor from the schedule for you automatically, which makes this process very efficient. But at the end of the day, from the expense side, you're going to have to enter those expenses here as a separate entry. So when we look at an estimate that we have in the system here, it's broken out by labor and the expenses associated with that expense. If I click into those expenses, just like we saw on the expense report here, we also have line-based entries for project-based expenses, right? So for this one, I've created an item for some freelancer hours. I also have one for a software license. When you enter these into the system, they are line-based entries. There's a bit more detail on these, and this reference references an item list, your purchase items. There is a turnkey list in Workamajig when you start, but typically your team will have customized this list to fit your needs. And just like with expense reports, you can set specific defaults for these. So if I choose the item talent, for example, I can tell Workamajig, hey, this has a standard cost. This has a standard markup. It should post to this sales, this GL account, this expense GL account. I will show you one of these at the item setup itself at some point here in the training. Just know that you populate this list here, and you also set the defaults for how the system should treat an item when you grab it. But in the process of creating an estimate, I would be setting the specific expenses associated with that project, right? I need some freelancer hours. You can see I've entered in 10 here at $75 an hour. I've marked that up 10%. So the grosses are billable amount to the client and also a software license, kind of the same thing here. And on an estimate, prior to approval, you'll see the ability to send out a quote, right? I don't need a vendor at the estimation level because I may be reaching out to multiple vendors for pricing on this, right? I need a freelancer. Maybe I reach out to 2 or 3 freelancers. Probably not. Maybe not, but your software license or an event space is a good example. We're shopping for an event space. There's 3 different options here. So I don't know who the specific vendor is, but I do know that it should cost about this much. Now, since this estimate is not approved, we see the option out of the line here to create a quote. This allows you to send the details of this item to multiple vendors to have them provide the quote in system. And you can choose the quote once you've kind of figured out which vendor that you want to go with. You can select a quote that the vendor can actually fill out themselves. Workamajig can send your vendors an email that they can fill out the details of, hey, here's the unit cost, here's the all-in cost. They can even attach things like spec sheets or and you can do the same thing when you send out a quote from the system here. When you have multiple quotes, you can select the quote that you're going with at the end, right? If I send out a quote to 3 different vendors and I choose vendor B, once I finalize it, I can choose that quote and Workamajig will update the item details in the estimate itself. Now, this is not a requirement for the purchase order process, of course. This is just if you want a formalized process to send vendor quotes from Workamajig and have those vendors be able to populate information directly into the system here for you regarding that quote and have you choose that one and kind of go with that vendor at a certain point. So if you do use the quote creation process, you would do this first. This would create a quote directly out of here for you on the estimate itself. But upon approval of your estimate, so let's go ahead and approve this here, you can create a purchase order directly out of your estimate. So when I go back into that same line here and I open it, now that since this is approved, we see the option to create a purchase order. And one of the reasons that we recommend this is basically what this is doing is grabbing the information that's already on your approved estimate with the assumption that, hey, we've already looked over this internally, we approved it there, the client looked over it, they approved the estimate with these expenses. Now we're ready to create this purchase order, right? Now that this project's ready to go underway, we have a signed scope of work, we internally agree on this. This is why we recommend doing this. It just kind of removes the margin for error, so I don't put in 8,000 instead of 800, something like that here. And you'll notice here, since I accidentally clicked this, when you create a purchase order, we do need a vendor at this point, right? So I can come in here and say, okay, we're going to use this vendor. And when we create a purchase order, Workamajig will automatically create that order detail for you and allow you to submit this purchase order for approval if you need. So let's let this go ahead and slide out here. Your POs look just like this. Again, we do auto number these. So the next number available here for my system is 1015. You'll notice this line is auto created, right? So it's just grab the line directly out of the estimate and it's pulled it here for us. And again, whether I'll see the option to either submit this PO for approval. So if I don't have a PO limit high enough to approve it, I'll see the option to submit it here. Or if I can approve it, I'll see the option to simply approve this. Now, typically this is sent to a PM or finance or both, depending on your workflow. You will see in the right-hand side under status who the approver is. This is another employee record level piece here where you can set the dollar limit that a person can approve. But by default, our purchase orders go to every person that has a dollar limit high enough to approve that purchase order. So you basically say per employee, hey, this person can either approve no POs, that's perfectly fine, or this person can approve a PO up to $5,000 or something like that. So since I have the approval limit to approve a $750 PO, I see the option to approve it. Otherwise, I'd see submit, and it would go to my approver, very similar to what we saw with those expense reports. And upon approval here, this becomes an item that can have a expense report applied to it. And again, we can also pre-bill an order if you'd like. Now, I'm not going to go too far into this process here today because we're looking primarily at expenses. But again, if you're interested in pre-billing orders, you can either pre-bill an order with multiple lines through the More button here, saying we're just pre-billing the whole thing, all of the lines on this here. Or in any specific line on your purchase order, you'll see the option to pre-bill a specific line, right? So there might be multiple lines on the PO, maybe even multiple different items, things like that. But you can choose, pick and choose which lines to pre-bill. And when you do, Workamajig will show you the client invoice that this line was pre-billed on in this area after you've done this. And when a vendor invoice is added to a PO, we'll also show the VO link, the vendor invoice link in here as well. You'll notice on the right-hand side for the order summary for purchase orders, we show how much has been applied to vendor invoices, or if it's been paid with a credit card charge or applied to a credit card charge, that's perfectly fine here too. We'll get back to both of these here in a little bit, but it's nice to know when you're looking at the summary that detail is here. And you can also see with a PO, you can link it to a spec sheet or make a file attachment to them here as well. Now, this is, again, how we would recommend creating POs for project-related expenses. But just know that if I go all the way back to the dashboard of the project here itself, we do have a separate area for purchase orders. This is another area where you can create these. So if your team doesn't have an estimate for a project, we definitely recommend that you do. But if they don't have an estimate for a project, or you just want to see a page where all of the POs for a project are listed in one place, there is a PO area down here. Again, we classify these by where they are in the approval process. So if it's waiting to be submitted, if it's waiting for approval, we'll show that here in this area. And once the orders themselves are open, it will show you that here as well. So this is an area where you can view your existing POs, or if you'd like, you can manually create a new PO. So this may be a part of the process that you need here as well. You may need to create manual purchase orders. That's perfectly fine. This is pretty similar to what we see out of the estimate when we create the expense line, but you're recreating all of the detail manually. And you will see when you enter this, you can enter a manual expense. Right. So I can just say, oh, I need an event space, we're creating an order for it. Or if there is an estimated expense and the expense is approved, you can come in here and say, oh, okay, I need to go ahead and create this license, right? Or create this PO for this specific item out of here as well. So you don't necessarily have to do it directly out of the estimate, but if you have to make a manual purchase order where there's no estimate line, you can do it here as well. And you can also check on the status of your orders in bulk from this page here as well. So following purchase orders would be our vendor invoices, right? If I've made an order, the expectation is at some point we are going to have a vendor invoice come into the system. Now, this would be done separate from the project. Your purchase orders by default would typically be added through this Today purchasing page. Again, from the main menu, you'd click the purchasing application, you'd click Today to come here. This plus button on this page here will allow you to create a vendor invoice. We're going to talk through a couple of different workflows for these. One, hey, I already have a purchase order. I'm just going to link a vendor invoice to it. And two, maybe I have an overhead expense, something like that. But when you enter a vendor invoice into the system here, from this page here, Workamajig will slide out this panel. There's a couple of different places to add vendor invoices here in Workamajig, but regardless of which one you use, all of them will get you to this very same page here. And the first thing we're going to ask for is the vendor, right? So if I choose my bootcamp vendor, this BC vendor, the one that I just used for our PO, when you choose the vendor first, any order number in the dropdown here, this will be for any open order you have with this vendor. That will populate here, right? So since I've chosen the vendor, it will show only orders open for this specific vendor. And so I can choose my PO to say, okay, the vendor invoice has now come in for my PO here. I'm going to go ahead and link those two things together. You'll notice when we do that, when we enter the order number information in here, Workamajig automatically fills a lot of these fields for you. So we already know which project it should be associated with. That's on the order. We know the vendor, things like that. So we'll go ahead and pull that in here. And for the exact amount here, that would be something that we enter after we click save, right? So I'd come in here and say, okay, this is a vendor invoice for my PO. I enter my vendor. I go ahead and choose the order that it's associated with. I enter my invoice posting and due date for this vendor invoice here. I can even add a description if I'd like, though this is optional. And when you save this here, after I go ahead and enter an invoice number, let's say 72523 for my invoice number. Obviously, this would typically be the one provided to you by the vendor, but I'm entering one in here since we're doing a test scenario. And when you save that vendor invoice here, since it's linked to an order, oh, I linked it to an insertion order instead of the PO I created, but same idea. It will show you all of the lines on your purchase order. And it will allow you to associate to tell us exactly how much it is. So if you got charged the exact $850 here for this, and they're charging for both lines, I can use the check boxes here next to that to say, yep, they're billing me for $1,700 exactly. That's what it will be. Or if the vendor charged you a little bit more or a little bit less, we'd want to note that here as well. We can say, oh, for line one, they actually charged us $845.88, and for line two, it was $853 and change or something like that. That's perfectly fine. If you need to do that, you have the option to change what the vendor's actually charging you and the difference from the PO here. But the system will allow you to change those in this line here. And when you save, we'll create a vendor invoice that automatically pulls these lines from here based off of these amounts, and pulls them into your vendor invoice for you. Right, just says, hey, you grabbed both of those lines here, you set what those amounts are, so we go ahead and create that vendor invoice. And I'm sure you're surprised at this point, but your vendor invoices themselves also have an approval process. And so if I am the approver on a vendor invoice, we'll see that here, or I'll see the option to submit. Again, our approver is here on the right-hand side. And since this vendor invoice is linked to order lines, when I click into the details of any of the lines in this vendor invoice, it will show you, hey, this was applied against this order in this amount. And if you've pre-billed it, like I did with this one here, it will show you the amount that was accrued and the amount that was unaccrued in here as well. So a lot of useful information in the line detail of these, especially if they're linked to other transactions, like I created a PO or an IO first, and then I created a vendor invoice linked to those lines. That does show within here. And for your vendor invoices, the significance of approval is that an invoice cannot be billed or paid until it's approved, right? So obviously this part of the process is very important. I will speak more to create the approval process here in just a moment. So let's go ahead and approve this one. Now, there's also going to be a need for vendor invoices that aren't linked to orders, right? Either it is a project-based expense that we simply don't have an order for, maybe your team doesn't use POs, or maybe they don't use POs for this specific expense that's come in here. That's perfectly fine. The process for this is very similar to adding the vendor invoice attached to an order. We just need some more additional details for things like which project and item, since we don't have an order source to pull that information from. You can also add vendor invoices for overhead expenses. You'll see that here. There's obviously going to be a need for that, right? This is a rent invoice, right, from our facility here, or it's the electric bill, something like that. Your overhead expenses can be entered through this way as well. These again can be scheduled for something like rent. The invoice itself may be pretty consistent. I can create one iteration of that invoice, and I can tell Workamajig to schedule that invoice to automatically recreate each month for me, or whatever period you pay rent, or whatever expense we're making here. But a standard vendor invoice will ask for the project and item. The item itself is going to be required. Project is not, although of course, if your expense is associated with an item, you absolutely should link it to an item. Again, the net is the actual cost of the transaction. So we'd fill all this out. Which vendor did it come from? What's our invoice number? What's our project and item? The expense GL account itself is typically derived from the item. Again, that setup that tells us, hey, if we use this item, it will pull in this expense account. But that would be our manual vendor invoice. And for overhead, if you click this checkbox, Workamajig considers any transaction that's not linked to a client or project overhead. So as soon as I click this, my project's going to disappear here, right? It says, hey, there's no project or client for this. This is an overhead expense. It's nice to click this because, again, we will give you reporting on specifically overhead transactions. But even without clicking this, again, any transaction not linked to a client or project will be considered overhead. And you can also have projects themselves that are considered overhead. Any transaction linked to it would be an overhead transaction. So whether it's an overhead transaction or whether it's a project expense that you want to track to a job and may or may not bill out to the client, we would want to fill out the information on this page. So if you're creating a manual invoice, let's go ahead and create one for rent, right? So we'll say that this is invoice number. We'll just call it rent in all caps. We'll put 725 in here. Now I probably want an item here associated with this, like some sort of overhead item. Maybe I have one specific for rent. That's all perfectly fine as well. We'll say my rent is, I don't know, $2,500. We'll keep it somewhat reasonable, I guess. And again, I can designate this as overhead, right? So this is an overhead item. I'll go ahead and click overhead. I've got the net here, and this will create a vendor invoice with a single line of that detail, right? So when I save this, my invoice number is up here. The line detail is here again. I don't have a project because this is overhead. And this is the same approval process as what we see out of an invoice created from a purchase order. Now I mentioned that you can schedule these invoices. So for something like rent, if we see this here and we say, yep, this is pretty consistent about this time of month, every month, I'm going to get an invoice for the rent for our facility here. If you click more and click create schedule, Workamajig will allow you to create a recurring transaction for this, basically saying, okay, I'm going to copy this invoice that you made for $2,500 from this vendor with this item. And in the settings, you can set how often you want this to recreate and a few niceties about how you want it to create. So you do need to set this by default. The frequency of this is for it to never happen. So you have to tell us how often you want it to happen. You can see there's quite a bit in here, but let's say this happens every month. We can tell Workamajig the next time that this should create, let's say is next month, the 25th, and Workamajig will just move this next date each time we create one of these, right? So on 8/25, we'll set the next date to 9/25 and so on and so forth. Now, in the reminder option here for a scheduled invoice, you can tell Workamajig to either show a reminder. That means don't make this invoice, just show me a reminder and allow me to click a button. Basically, it's a one button click that makes the invoice for you. Or you can tell the system to automatically create the invoice. Basically, go ahead and put it in the queue for us automatically. Now, this doesn't have to be approved by default, although it can, or it can just go through the standard approval process if you'd like it to here. But the reminder is kind of how you tell us how you want us to handle the creation of this. Do you want to just a notification and then you click a button to create it, or do you want us to make it for you? You can set how many of these should create. By default, it's basically all of them forever until you tell us to stop. That's perfectly fine. You can have a reminder days in advance of the next date that this is coming if you'd like. And you can see there's an option in here to create these as approved. So you can say, hey, as soon as this date comes, make me an invoice, create it automatically, and make it approved so it's payable right away. Or you can make sure that it dumps into an approval process first. Those things are both fine. But just want to make sure that I showed this here. This does not just apply to vendor invoices. This applies to many transaction types in Workamajig. You can schedule client invoices. You can schedule vendor invoices. There's a lot that you can set to recur here. But I at least wanted to show it here when we're looking at overhead expenses, because this is an area where I think that tool particularly shines. And after you've created a schedule, if you're a schedule for this invoice, if you click the more button, you can actually view that schedule in here as well. Now, for invoice approval for vendor invoices, there's a few things I want to show on this. So there's some setup on the back end of the system for your vendor invoices. If I go, I'm going to choose my other tab here for this. This is an area that you may or may not have access to, but of course, it's definitely worth knowing how to set up the structure for this. In Admin Manager System Setup, we can take a look at your transaction preferences, actually for both purchase orders and vendor invoices. This tells the system, hey, there's a default set of ways I want the system to handle purchase orders or vendor invoices, for example. And one of the things that we'll see in vendor invoices is the default approver. Now, by default in Workamajig, the approver for vendor invoices is the account manager on the project. But you can change this to say, oh, the person on the entering the invoice is the approver. This is pretty common in agencies that have a single finance person that kind of handles everything. They would often enter and approve them. You can say that they're just automatically approved, or you can enter a specific person to be the approver on all vendor invoices. So know that this is the default, but you can kind of change how these work if you'd like. Now, I also do want to talk about the process of paying vendor invoices here as well. So if I go to this Today Purchasing page here again, once my vendor invoices are approved, again, kind of scrolling past some of the open items and incoming charges here, this to pay as of area here will show you everything that for payables that are approved. And we have three major categories for this. We've talked about two of them, expense reports and vendor invoices. As soon as these are created here, and they're approved, they will show up in this area here. We do pull today's date by default here, but you can look into the future. You can say, I want to see everything that's payable in August, and we'll repopulate the details here. And this is designed to be a mass payment tool. Now, there's two ways to make payments. One of them is through this tool itself. The other one is to click the plus button up here and make a one-time payment. I'll briefly show this, although I think the mass payment tool is a bit easier for this. If you create a manual payment, you're saying I'm creating a payment from us here to an open invoice here in the system, and allow you to do one at a time here. So you can come in here and say, yep, my vendor was this particular vendor. It will show you all of the open invoices for this vendor. And when you make the payment, you can pay one or multiple invoices, right? So I can say, oh, okay, we're paying $5,000 worth to this vendor itself. You don't have to add a check number. We actually normally create this for you when you print these. But of course, you do want to review your payment and posting date here. And there's two ways to handle this. One, you can have the system just auto apply this payment to any open invoices for the vendor. This will pay the oldest invoices first in order. Or you can come through here and check which invoices you'd like to pay. So I can say, oh, I'm going to pay this one. I'm going to pay this one, and this one. And this one. I guess I have 5, right? So we can come through here and click. You can also set the amount that you want to apply to each invoice. So by default, we're going to try to pay all of it if we can, but you can say, oh, I'm only half paying this invoice this time, and then I'm going to pay half of this one. Again, I know the scenario is a little goofy. I just want you to know you can adjust the amount fields here if you'd like. More often than not, this is a one-to-one payment, right? I have an invoice from the vendor. It's this one. I'm paying that $1,000 for it. So I can go ahead and enter that check amount, click this here. Very handy is this unapplied amount here. This lets you know whether or not there's something from this check that isn't being attributed to an invoice and closing that invoice. So if this is anything other than 0, you probably do want to make sure that everything is being properly applied in these amount columns here. And you can go ahead and save this. Workamajig will make that payment for you and associate it with that invoice. So when I save this here, we'll see both at the payment level that, okay, it's paying for this specific invoice. You'll see that a payment that pays an invoice or multiple invoices, you could open those invoices from the payment itself. And it will show you all of the details associated with this, whether or not it's paid, whether or not it's been posted, things like that. But again, that's the one-off, the one-time payment entry here. Typically, if I was training a new organization to use Workamajig here, I would try to encourage them to use the mass payment screen. This is just an easier way to make these payments. We have 4 vendor invoices here. It shows I have 66,000 in my instance here currently. So if I click into this here, you'll see a bunch of filters here on the left. This is a way for you to obviously filter down the results to only certain things that you want to look for here. I can look for a certain vendor, a certain client. I can only look at invoices that have been billed to the client at this point, or the number of different options that you have in here. But by default, we pull open everything. We show all of the different invoices that are open here for you. And just like on the previous screen, we can use the check boxes to make payments for these. Now, if there are multiple vendors in here, it's of course going to make multiple different payments, right? So if I do a payment here where I select all of these, it's going to create one payment for this same BC vendor that we're using. But if I also come down here and click my test vendor, it's going to say, okay, I'm creating 2 payments, one for this vendor here for all of these lines, all of these invoices, one for this vendor here for these 2 lines. And these payments, when you make them, they don't open automatically. So if I click, let's click these 3 lines here, and then let's pay these 2 for test vendor, it'll say this is the total amount that you're going to pay. When you click the option to pay, it will give you some details around, hey, are you paying this out of a bank account? So I can use my cash account. It will show you the balances here and have the payment date. Or you can pay with a credit card if you've created them in your system. You can select which credit card you'd like to use here. But I'm going to go ahead and pay this out of checking and go ahead and generate the payments. And since we're making multiple payments typically from this screen, when you generate payments, Workamajig will make the payments, but it won't slide out the actual payments itself. What it will do here is go from this area here where you made those payments and enter those into the payments queue. It basically says, hey, you made a number of different payments, so now you have some checks to print, right? It's nice that you made the record here in system, but this area will show you the checks to print. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to print a physical check from Workamajig here. You can also use ACH, things like that, but this basically says these are all the payments in the system here that aren't that either haven't had a check printed for them or haven't had an ACH record created for them. So there's really a couple of different ways to go here. One is to say, okay, I want to print all 4 of these checks, right? I can go ahead and click this option here and say, yep, let's go ahead and print these checks. Or I can mark as ACH and post these payments. We actually do not post payments until we either have a check printed from the system here or until we have a ACH number added. So one of those two things, but we'll typically post those payments at that point. So if you do print physical checks, that's perfectly fine. The checkbox here will print checks for each one of these payments that you've created. If you'd like to review the payments themselves before you print them, you can open the details to see what you're paying here. But at the end of the day, if you're printing physical checks, the checkboxes here next to it will set which ones you print. When you click print checks, it will slide out a PDF of the checks themselves. This is in your check stock format. You can tell Workamajig if you have stub check or check stub like you see here. You can tell the system how you want your check stock looks here, but it will basically print all of these out here. You can print these physically from this page here. And when we go back to the previous page, it will have you confirm printing just to make sure the printer didn't run out of ink or you didn't accidentally kick it and the page went in sideways or something like that. We will have you confirm that everything went okay, and then we'll assess the check numbers, the next check numbers from your bank account here to those checks. Now, I also mentioned that you can mark these as ACH as well. So if you're not actually printing physical checks, that's perfectly fine. You still do want to make sure those payments are posted, and Workamajig will auto-generate ACH numbers for you for these. So it's nice to clear these queues to basically show, yep, this is done. I want that payment posted and have all of that information there. And if you use ACH files that you send to your bank or to a third party or something like that, Workamajig does have the option for you to be able to use ACH here in the system and have the system output a text ACH file that you can send to your bank or to a financial institution to make these payments on your behalf. So you can click download ACH file. Workamajig will go ahead and do that. And you'll notice next to use ACH, you can set these settings for the ACH information that you'd want to enter, right? What's my company ID? What's the bank name? What's their account number? There are a few ways to customize this. We do use the Notcha standard for ACH files here, but we have noticed that depending on the financial institution, their definition of Notcha standard is a little bit different occasionally from what we read here. So we do have some advanced options if the first file that you send over to your bank doesn't quite meet their requirements. Most of the time, if this is something that you're interested in using, I recommend sending over an example file to your bank and making sure with them that it meets the standard. And if there's anything different, if they need any changes made to the file, please reach out to us here at support. We can help you get that file to where it needs to be. They're pretty customizable at this point. So that's generally fairly easy for us to get a file output in the standard that you need. And once we get these settings in place, the system will just always create the correct file type for that. Okay, so getting a teeny bit squeezed on time here, but just wanted to make sure I showed the payment options here. All right, so we pay out of here for mass payments. You can also make individual payments through here. Your payments will go into a workflow here that will clear out as soon as I print these checks or mark them as ACH. This number will, of course, disappear. And I want to spend the last of our session here talking about credit cards. That is the other major expense type that we'd have here in Workamajig. This is obviously a pretty big one, and there are 3 ways to get credit card charges in the system. One is to manually create those credit card charges. Please don't do that. That's a lot of work, and it's typically unnecessary. You can import your credit card charges using an OFX or QFX file. You can import them with a CSV file. There's a number of different methods to do that. That has varying degrees of levels of difficulty. It can be pretty easy. It can be slightly a bit challenging, or we can have the system automatically pull those charges into for you here from your financial institution. That's this incoming charges area here and this credit card connector. Now, the credit card connector is basically a holding place for transactions that we pulled into the system for you. And they are not actual credit card charges in Workamajig until you've actually processed them through the connector. Now, while any of the three options I've mentioned to you are viable, for my new clients, I always recommend they set up the connector. It's significantly easier than the other processes for creating them. And there's a really nice workflow for getting these into the system. So let me pop this open so you can kind of get an idea of what it looks like. For each one of the GL accounts that you have for credit cards in the system, you'll have an entry in the dropdown here. And Workamajig will show you, hey, these are the entries that you've made on your credit card. We automatically download these once a day if you make that connection with your vendor. And the purpose of this screen is for us to be able to enter the information that our financial institution wouldn't have. So things like the payee, the amount, the date, those are all coming from the financial institution, right? If it's on their website, we get it, we pull it into Workamajig here. The purpose of having them in the connector is a way for us to code these to the specific project, item, and expense account that they would need to be attributed to before we enter them in the system. And it can be more than that, but those are the three most specific common things that you do, right? This is a project expense, so I need to tell the system, oh yeah, it's related to this specific project, and it is this specific item, for example, right? Whichever one that we choose here. So you'd kind of code all of this information, make sure that we're pointing it to the correct project, pointing it to the correct item and expense account number, and then we would process that charge, which would create it as a actual credit card charge in the system here for you. Now, a note on this here, this doesn't have to be an independent credit card charge. If you paid if you paid an invoice with this credit card charge, you can tell Workamajig that this charge covers an invoice that will close the payable for the invoice and create a payable credit card charge for you. You can link a credit card charge to orders through here as well. So there's a number of different ways to do this. And if you have one charge that actually needs to be split between multiple projects, you can do that as well. So the design here is really is to code these here in the system and then go ahead and grab them and process them directly out of the connector. If you're downloading the charges or if you're importing the charges, they also can be imported through here via the More button, this OFX QFX file or CSV. I would actually recommend OFX QFX if you can. This is a significantly easier import than the CSV import, but you can download these from your vendor and pull them into the system. Again, I would only use this if you have to. Plaid is typically the best way to go here. And the setup for Plaid, we have a great help guide article for this in our support site. If you just search Plaid on support at support.workamajig.com, it will take you through this here. You can also, of course, reach out to your account manager. We're always happy to help with these. But the process for this basically would be setting them up in system setup here. There's an area in connections where we use a third-party tool under banking called Plaid. Right, so banking and then Plaid. If you have existing Plaid connections, those will show here. If you need to create a new one, you can click this plus button. And effectively what this has you do is log into your credit card, your financial institution that owns your credit cards or holds your credit cards for you the same way that you would through their online site. Now, you typically want to use the master account for this, the one that would be able to see multiple credit card accounts here with this setup. And once you've completed it here, you'll have the connection that will show you all of the different cards that we found in this connection. So I only have one on this particular connection, but if you have 10 cards, that's perfectly fine. You do need to map them after they're found, where it will show each card and then which GL account you want us to put those charges to. This is a very important part of that process, again, detailed in the Plaid setup guide here. And once you do, those charges will pull into Workamajig here onto the connector screen for processing. I have a question here about reviewing how to download charges manually. So with the connector here, you can download through here. If Plaid is not working for you, please send us an email. We can reach out to Plaid or we can troubleshoot it for you to figure out why those aren't downloading. It's relatively rare that that happens, but we may need to open a ticket with them to take a look. So I would say to start with, I would definitely reach out to us here to see if we can troubleshoot that Plaid connection for you. And if not, then of course you can download them manually using the import files here. You can do that in the meantime while we troubleshoot that for you. Or of course, with the plus button here, you can create manual credit card charges from the purchasing today page. For Julia says, we see 2 charges on our connector when I pay an invoice via credit card from purchasing, then another charge when the credit card downloads the charges. So if you're creating a payment here through this tool for that invoice, if you're using the connector, you typically want to wait for the payment, the record to come through the connector here, and then link it this way. If I create a payment and then I have one come in here, we don't want to create the 2, right? So I would come in here as soon as that pulled in. If I've already made that payment, you can actually download it to get it immediately if it's on that website, if it's on your financial institution's website, and I can say, yep, let's go ahead and pay the invoice this way. This tends to be the best way to do this. Yeah, instead of creating both of them, right? So the payment, you only really need to make a payment like this if you're paying by check or something like that. The credit card connector can just link to it and create that charge for you without making a separate payment for it. Yeah, exactly. Kind of do it in reverse, right? Don't create the payment here. Let that charge come in for the charge that you charge the vendor invoice to, and then go ahead and link the 2 together. Okay, any other questions? I know I kind of ran right up against the time here today. A lot to talk about. If not, that's perfectly fine. So I would say if you use credit cards and you don't have Plaid set up, I would highly recommend setting that up here. Again, you can check our support site here at support.workamajig.com to find this article. It is Plaid. Of course, you can also just reach out to us here by support at workamajig.com. If you send us an email, we can help you out with those. For my attendee that was having issues with your Plaid connection, please reach out to us. I'd love to help you with that, or we can get your account manager to help you with that either way and get that back up and running for you. If you don't use this and you're interested in it, or you have questions on purchase order workflows, anything like that, that you'd like to implement as part of your process, again, please feel free to reach out to us or your account manager here at Workamajig. We'd love to talk to you about that, get that set up for you. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have for you guys. I just want to thank you all for coming here, and thanks for spending an extra minute or 2 for me past the time. If you guys need anything, or you have any questions, or you're feeling tired, lonely, or sad, please feel free to email us at support@workamajig.com. We'll be here to help. Okay, everybody. Thanks so much. You guys have a great day.